Welcome back, Sebastian here. So today I want to review my preseason predictions for the 2024 F1 season. And I also want to take a look at my model predictions. So the predictions that my qualifying model and my race model basically made using historical data for the 2024 F1 season teammate pairings. Just because I think it's always interesting to see how the model compares to what actually happened. So first, today we're going to take a look at my admittedly pretty terrible predictions for this year's F1 season. So we're going to be looking at the drivers, the drivers championship standings in reverse order, so starting from the bottom and working our way up to the top. So of course, when I made these predictions, I'll put a link up in the bar above, so you can check that video out if you'd like. When I made those predictions, there was of course only 20 drivers, and we actually ended up with 24 for basically different substitute drivers or drivers who basically were called in to replace drivers who had been sacked mid-season. So obviously, to start, I'm just going to go through the bottom four in the actual championship standings from this year. So of course, 24th you had Doohan, 23rd Sargent, 22nd Bottas, and 21st you had Lawson. Obviously, for Doohan, one race, not a surprise that he's last. Lawson as well only had 6 races out of 24, so only raced a quarter of the season. So again, not a big surprise to see him there. I'd say really, if you told me that there were 24 drivers who had raced coming into the season, I think Bottas would definitely be the one I would be quite surprised to see him there, especially given that his teammate is of course not amongst that group. Now, taking a look at number 20 for actual and for the prediction. So in my predictions, I actually predicted Magnussen to be 20th. I was not particularly high on Haas going into the season. I assumed that they were just going to have the same tire wear issues that they really suffered with last year, and again resulted in them being the slowest car. Well, they were just not the slowest car over one lap last year, but they were definitely the slowest car in the races. Now, 20th in the actual championship was Zhou, and of course, a bit of a surprise that Zhou ends up ahead of Bottas, even without the result in Qatar, where Zhou got 4 points for his 8th place finish. Zhou still would have ended up ahead of Bottas simply because of Kalmbach, I think, having more, well, basically, he had, if we just remove Qatar entirely, he would have had one more 11th place finish, which would have kept him ahead of his teammate. Now, going up to number 19, you'll see that there's again a trend with me not being super high on Haas, as I had Hülkenberg and Magnussen, the bottom 2 drivers in the Drivers' Championship. Obviously, things didn't work out quite that way, but again, putting Hülkenberg ahead of Magnussen in the championship, I was right in that respect. In the actual championship, 19th was Colpinto, a guy that I think 99% of fans probably didn't think was going to make his F1 debut this season. Definitely a surprise signing mid-season, replacing Logan Sargent. I think if you asked people before the season that if Sargent would be replaced mid-season, I don't think too many people would be surprised, given he had a very poor first season. But the fact that Colpinto was the driver who ended up replacing him, I do think quite a few people would have been surprised by that fact. All right, now, number 18, I actually had the aforementioned Logan Sargent, had on the bottom of the 2 Williams drivers. And of course, number 18th in reality was Behrman, who of course drove 3 Grand Prix, 1 with Ferrari and 2 with Haas. The reason he was so high up in the championship standings relative to how few Grand Prix he did was the fact that he of course got a 7th place in his F1 debut driving for Ferrari in Jeddah at the 2nd race of the season. So obviously some special circumstances there, but nonetheless some pretty impressive outings by Behrman, and of course he'll be making his full-time F1 debut this next year. All right, moving up to number 17, I have Zhou, 17th in the actual standings. Ricciardo, as you can see, Ricciardo hasn't shown up yet in my predictions. I actually had predicted Ricciardo to be pretty high, so again, a bit surprising that Ricciardo was this low. Again, I think a lot of people had some pretty high expectations. He was very close with Tsunoda in his comeback in 2023. Of course, he came back from his broken wrist as well. So again, you had 2 factors there that meant that it was understandable why he would have been a little bit off the pace over 1 lap in race pace compared to Tsunoda, and I think there were pretty high expectations for Ricciardo going into 2024. Number 16th, I had Bottas ahead of Zhou. Didn't think Sauber was going to be as bad as they were. Honestly, at the start of the season, They weren't that terrible, but it was just that as the season progressed, they got worse and worse, and it was really only the last 3 or 4 races where things kind of started to turn around for them. And of course, actual rankings, I had Albon in the actual rankings, Albon came 16. So again, got the head-to-head for Sauber wrong. And again, I think just because Sauber was such a bad car this year, it of course means that points are a lot less reliable. With that being said, if you do it, but even if you do it based on average finishing position, Zhou still has the better statistics compared to Bottas. All right, number 15th, I predicted Albon 15th, Magnussen, and of course Magnussen came 15th in reality. So again, pretty close with the prediction for Albon there. Again, and I had him ahead of his teammates. That was also correct. Number 14th, Ocon, and in reality, it was Ocon as well. So again, this is my first prediction where I actually got it right. There are a couple that I did get right, and I made these predictions after winter testing. So again, Alpine were very, very slow at winter testing, but I figured that because it was known that they came into the 2024 season with a new car concept, that I figured that they were going to be able to make pretty big gains through the season. So that's why I didn't actually predict Alpine to be dead last in the Constructors' Championship. Of course, their first of their 2 drivers shows up at 14, so I didn't expect them to come back through the season, and that's kind of what happened. Number 13, I predicted Gasly, and in reality, 13th was Stroll. So again, without the events of the Brazilian Grand Prix, Gasly probably ends up 13th, around 13th, and Ocon, I think, ends up a little bit lower than he actually would have. Again, if you removed his result from Brazil, I think he only has 5 points over the whole season, which would have put him below Behrman. So again, that one race in Brazil definitely makes things look a little bit more favorable for both Alpine drivers. But again, you can't just take away one result. Number 12, Tsunoda in both rankings. And of course, I had Tsunoda below Ricciardo, so I thought Ricciardo would finish ahead of Tsunoda. In hindsight, that turned out to not be correct. Even ignoring the fact that Ricciardo, of course, basically only did 3/4 of the season. Even when Ricciardo was dropped after the Singapore Grand Prix, he was still behind his teammate Tsunoda. So I think Tsunoda had a pretty good season, and again, a little bit better than I expected. Number 11 in my predictions was Stroll, and again, I don't think that was too far off what where Aston Martin were in reality. Again, he was actually in 11th place for most of the season. It was only like the last couple of weeks where he ended up getting passed by first by Gasly, and then I think by Tsunoda as well. So again, just looking at the bottom 10, really the biggest difference I think is Haas having a much better season than I think anyone really anticipated. They really got on top of their tire wear issues, and that was really the big difference. I think the other big one is the fact that I think Ricciardo was not quite as good as many people expected. And again, outside of that, I think bottom half of the championship is pretty similar to what we would have expected, maybe with, again, Sauber being a little bit worse than we thought. All right, now moving into the top 10. Top 10th in my predictions was Ricciardo. So again, I had him kind of best of the rest, minus the driver that I have in 9th. Again, that prediction didn't really come true. Ricciardo kind of struggled. And it seems the first quarter of the season when Ricciardo really was struggling as the most was actually when the RB was at its best. So it's kind of not an ideal situation there. And as for Ricciardo kind of matched Tsunoda and kind of looked to be have the upper hand, especially in the races. The car was not so good, so I think a little bit of an unfortunate dynamic there. But 10th in the actual championship was Gasly. Very, very good season from him, and again, a little bit fortunate with the result from Brazil. 9th for both predictions and for the actual championship standings was Alonso. Again, I think that was a pretty smart pick, given that I think going into the season, it seemed like Aston Martin were the clear 5th best team, and I think that was kind of the right call, not putting Alonso higher than 9th. They again ended the second half of last season pretty poorly, and again from the start of this season, they always looked to really be the 5th best team, and they were kind of in no man's land for the whole season with regards to the championship. Simply because they were clear of everyone else and they were behind everyone else. So even by the time we got to I would say the last third of the season where they were really battling it out with your Haas, your RB, Alpine. They had basically created, or at least Alonso had created enough of a buffer in the constructors championship that that fifth place was never really at risk. All right, now moving into the top 8, and of course, all of these drivers are going to belong to the big 4 teams: your Red Bull, McLaren, Ferrari, and Mercedes. So 8th in my predictions was actually Oscar Piastri, whereas 8th in reality was Sergio Perez. So I was not super high on McLaren going into the season. Thought they had an okay preseason testing, and again, going into the first couple races of the season, they were okay. They were probably the 3rd best team, probably a little bit behind Ferrari. And again, I don't think, of course, last season they had massive in-season development, going from arguably the slowest team at the start of the season to being the 2nd fastest team by the end. So again, there was not really a guarantee that was going to happen again. And that so again, predicting that was going to happen again was kind of, again, a bit of a long shot. They started out, I think, 4th best team, and then of course got a little bit better. So my prediction, I guess, for McLaren was a little bit low, especially considering that they ended up being constructors champions. So number 7 is in my predictions was Russell, and number 7 in reality was Lewis Hamilton. So getting a Mercedes in 7th was correct, but I did get the wrong Mercedes. I did think that Russell had a pretty weak 2023, and I figured with the fact that Hamilton had such a strong 2023, I thought, surely it wouldn't be too difficult to imagine him carrying that form over into 2024. And of course, I made these predictions after it was announced that he would be going to Ferrari. So again, maybe I underestimated, maybe that fact, because again, as we know, Hamilton does tend to need to be, tend to need to be encouraged by his team a little bit more than some other drivers need to be, and supported by his team. So, and again, with the fact that he was going to be leaving the team to a rival, it's natural that he would be left out of certain meetings, and certain information as the season went along would not be given to him. Number 6 in my predictions, McLaren. So again, like I said before, not really super high on them going into the season, but again, I did get the order of the 2 McLaren drivers right. And 6 in reality was Russell. Number 5, Sainz. Again, I got that one right. So for Sainz, I think he performed about as well as I expected. He was going to do a pretty good job, but again, still end up behind his teammate. Number 4 in my predictions was Sergio Perez, but number 4 in reality was Piastri. So interesting that I basically had Perez and Piastri swapped around. I expected Red Bull to be very, very strong this year, not quite as dominant as last year, but still I expected them to be about similar to 2022 levels of dominance, and because of that, I expected that Perez would at least be good enough to be able to finish 4th. Things obviously didn't turn out that way. Season was much more competitive. Red Bull was not as dominant, not quite as good, and so I think again makes sense that in some respects that Perez would end up a lot lower down. If we knew now what we knew then, I probably again would have had Perez quite a bit lower. Number 3, in my predictions, I had Hamilton. So again, that was the same spot he finished in 2023, and I thought, wouldn't be too hard for him to continue that form. But in reality, he finished 7th. Again, a bit of a disappointing season for him. And in reality, I had Leclerc finish 3rd, which again, he hasn't shown up yet. But spoiler alert, he shows up 2nd. So again, not a big difference from Leclerc. I did predict him to finish 2nd. In my predictions, but again, 2nd and 3rd, not a big difference. And I did think that he would probably be the main challenger to Verstappen if there even was a challenge to Verstappen. Again, Norris ends up finishing 2nd, whereas I had him 6th in my prediction. So, a bit of a difference there. Definitely kind of underrated McLaren compared to what actually happened. But that being said, I think going into the season, I didn't really expect a championship challenge. And while we kind of got one, it was basically over by Brazil, and the gap was never really smaller than 40 points, I think, at any point during the season. Basically, obviously once we got past, once Verstappen got his championship lead up to that point. So, and of course, I did predict a Max Verstappen championship, which is exactly what we got. So there you go. There's my prediction. So now we're going to move on and look at my model predictions. And these are basically looking at historical F1 data from 2008 to basically up to 2023, so up to, again, last season. And it basically uses all the data to try to predict different parameters, points difference, qualifying gap, finishing average finishing position gap, all these different things. I'm only going to share a couple of them, one for qualifying, one for the race, just to keep things a little bit simple. So first, we're going to look at qualifying model predictions. And again, these are only going to be for the teammate pairings that we started the season with. So I'm not doing it for Colapinto and Alba, and I'm not doing it for Lawson and for Tsunoda. And again, so for the drivers, you'll notice all the drivers are listed in Constructors' Championship order from this season. The driver on the left is the one who was predicted to finish ahead. So that's why all the stats are going to be relative to that driver who is ahead, listed on the left. So starting from 10th in the constructors, we have Bottas and Zhou. So my predicted median qualifying gap for Bottas and Zhou was 0.214 in Bottas's favor. Actual gap turned out to be quite a bit bigger, 0.482. And again, I'll just mention as well, these gaps in addition to basically using all the historical data, it's corrected to how the age of the drivers as well as how experienced the drivers are. So, for example, if Alonso right now is obviously not as good of a qualifier as he was in his prime, so again, he will have a little bit of basically when doing calculations, he'll take a little bit of a penalty because of the fact that he is 42 years. He was 42 years of age this season. So yeah, Bottas and Zhou, Bottas the gap definitely a little bit bigger than was expected. Now, moving on to Williams, the predicted gap between Albon and Sargent was 0.522 seconds. And again, Albon did win the teammate head-to-head, but the gap was a little bit smaller. The actual gap was 0.304 seconds. Now we get to the first one, where this is one that I knew going into the season that it was a much that in both the race model and the qualifying model, Ricciardo Tsunoda was going to be much different compared to what the model thought. Tsunoda basically coming into the season, his only teammate head-to-head that was relevant to the model was his first 2 years against Gasly, and of course didn't do so well against Gasly, and he's definitely developed as a driver since then, which is why I kind of was like, yeah, this probably isn't going to be too accurate. Also compared with the fact that, Ricciardo the last couple of years has not been particularly strong, basically ever since he went to McLaren. So in the predictions, it predicted that Ricciardo was going to out-qualify Tsunoda with a median qualifying gap of 0.32 seconds. Pretty big gap there. And in reality, it was actually Tsunoda who had the advantage of 0.179. So that's the first driver pairing on the grid where it basically didn't even get the driver right. Now we get to Hülkenberg Magnussen. This one again got right. So predicted gap was 0.156 seconds, where in reality it was 2.310. So a little bit bigger than expected. Now we get to Gasly Ocon. The predicted gap was 0.122 in Gasly's favor, but it actually turned out to be 0.04 of a second in Ocon's favor. So this is a bit of an interesting one. First third of the season or so, I would say Ocon definitely had the advantage in qualifying, but as the season went along, Gasly definitely got better and better. And if Ocon hadn't been dropped for the last race of the season, it's very much possible that Gasly would have basically out-qualified him that race. The gap would have been 12-12, and it would have been, the median gap would have likely gone in Gasly's favor. So really kind of one of those interesting stats where the circumstances being a little bit different, the result would have been different as well. All right, now we move on to Alonso and Stroll, and this one was actually very close to the prediction. So the model predicted that Alonso would out-qualify Stroll with a median gap of 0.278 seconds, and in reality it was 0.287. So very close between the prediction and reality there. Now we move on to Mercedes, and for Mercedes, this one was again one of the ones that it got wrong. So for Hamilton, Russell, the model predicted that Hamilton would out-qualify Russell with a median qualifying gap of 0.028 seconds, despite the fact that Russell actually out-qualified Hamilton last year. And in reality, this was not a particularly close qualifying head-to-head. Russell had the advantage there with a median qualifying gap of 0.19 in his favor. Now, moving on to the top 3 in the constructors. Next one was actually Verstappen and Perez was actually the closest of the 10 teams. So for the predicted model, it was 0.413 seconds, where in reality it was 0.412. So 1,000th of a second off. So it's very, very close. And again, a little bit surprising that it was actually that close. But I think for me, it really highlights that Perez didn't, compared to what the historical precedent had been, and again, according to the model, suggests that Perez wasn't actually that much worse or wasn't that bad in qualifying compared to kind of the expectations about him. 3 to 4 tenths gap to Verstappen, honestly, not that big of a surprise. It's really the race gap where there was, I think, a lot of surprise about just how poor the results were. All right, now moving on to Leclerc Sainz. Again, this one was a little bit off. So for the model, it predicted that Leclerc would outqualify Sainz with a median qualifying gap of 1.3 tenths of a second, but in reality it was actually 8 thousandths of a second, one of the closest teammate head-to-heads, second only to the Alpine. So again, a little bit closer, but again, even if you look at last year's data, last year I think Leclerc outqualified Sainz by about a tenth and a half. Was the median gap. So again, much closer this year, despite the fact that I think Leclerc won 2/3 of the head-to-head. So I think it was just that Leclerc and Sainz had many qualifying sessions where the gap between them was very, very small. Now, final pair, Norris and Piastri. So for Norris, Piastri, the predicted gap was 0.177 in Norris's favor, where in reality the gap was 0.109. So a lot of people are talking online about how Piastri did really poorly in qualifying, how I think the head-to-head is 20 to 4 in Norris's favor. And I think, to be honest, the 20 to 4 is an issue, but when you look at just the median gap here between himself and Norris, it's actually not that bad, and it's actually better than what was predicted by the model based on his rookie season. So I'm not too fussed about Piastri's qualifying, to be honest. I do think, it would be nice if he could basically take another half a tenth out of that, and again, improve his tire wear, tire management a bit as well. But again, I don't think he's that far off of Norris, especially in one lap. Like, again, a tenth of a second isn't that much. And again, he's only had 2 years in F1. And as Franz Tost always says, it takes 3 years to develop an F1 driver. So it'll be interesting to see how much of an improvement, again, Piastri is able to make in his 3rd season next year. So finishing off this video, taking a look at the race model predictions. And it's difficult to present this data because obviously you basically have to guess going into the season how many points the team's going to get, and obviously it's well off of that mark. So what I've done is I've basically taken the points total that the teams ended up with, and I've basically redistributed it based on what the result is. So we're going to start with Bottas show, just because we're doing this order, and because I think conceptually it's going to be a lot easier to understand. So for Bottas show, obviously for Sauber they only scored 4 points. So based on the predicted gap between Bottas and Zhou in the race, if the team only scores 4 points, Bottas would be predicted to get 3 of those points, and Zhou would be predicted to only get 1 of those points. And again, if you do the percentages, that would be 75% Bottas, 25% for Zhou. And of course, in reality, that was wrong. In reality, it was 0% for Bottas, 100% for Zhou, as Zhou got all 4 of the team's points. And again, I made a video presenting these results earlier in the season before the season got earlier in the year before the season got started. So again, I'll put a link up above. Get my finger in the right spot. Put a link up above. So again, if you're interested, you can check that video out as well. Again, the other thing with this is it means that I can basically for the teammates where they didn't do the full season together, so Ricciardo, Tsunoda, and Albon Sargent, I believe it is going to be based on the total for the races where those teammates were together, so not the full season tally. Okay, so for Albon and Sargent, I predicted 100% of the team's points would go to Albon if they scored 17 points. And again, that's kind of exactly what happened, although of course it was with 4 points instead of 17. And again, so that one was kind of bang on there. Next, Ricciardo Tsunoda. The model predicted that Ricciardo would get 79% of the team's points, Tsunoda 21%. But during their time as teammates, it was definitely quite the opposite, very, very similar to the qualifying, where it was completely off what actually happened. Where in reality, it was 35% Ricciardo, 65% Tsunoda. Moving on to Haas, this one again a little bit off compared to where things were. The model predicted that Hülkenberg would get 59% of the team's points, Magnussen 41%, where in reality Hülkenberg got 72% and Magnussen only 28%. So again, a bit of a bigger gap than expected. Now moving on to Alpine, model predicted 41% for Gasly, 51% for Gasly, 49% for Ocon. This was predicted to be the closest between teammates. In reality, 61% for Gasly, 39% for Ocon. Again, that does not include the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, which of course Ocon did not partake in. But I believe Gasly's fifth place in Qatar definitely skews things quite a bit, given that the fact that they finished second and third in Brazil, it kind of cancels out each other's results there. Now, moving on to Aston Martin. So for Alonso Stroll, the predicted gap percentages was 80% Alonso, 20% for Stroll, whereas in reality, 74% for Alonso, 26% for Stroll. So a little bit closer than expected. Now, moving on to Mercedes. Again, this was another one of the gaps where the model unfortunately got things wrong. 53% for Hamilton, 47% for Russell was the prediction, where in reality it was 52% for Russell, 48% for Hamilton. So again, the predicted gap was almost identical to what actually happened, just it was flipped between the two drivers. Now, moving on to Red Bull, and this is the one that I was alluding to earlier. So the predicted gap based on how many points Red Bull scored, 64% for Verstappen, 36% for Perez, whereas in reality is a 10% further away from that. 74% for Verstappen, 26% for Perez. Very, very ugly number there for Perez. Now, moving on to Ferrari. Ferrari is predicted to be 55% Leclerc, 45% Sainz. In reality, pretty close to that, 54% Leclerc, 46% for Sainz. And then finishing off with McLaren, 57% Norris, 43% Piastri, where in reality, 56% Norris, 44% Piastri. So a little bit closer than expected for Piastri for both the qualifying and for the race model. So again, I think a lot of people expected a little bit more from him this year, but to contrast that, my models actually predicted the gaps would be a little bit bigger than what we actually got. So yeah, curious to see how that works out. So I think for both the qualifying model and for the race model, 70% accuracy. And again, I think the qualifying model I hadn't made last year. So again, I can't tell you what it would have predicted for last year, but for the race model, I know it was correct for 7 of the 10 teams. Again, for this year, 7 of the 10 teams. So 70% accuracy, 70% accuracy over 2 years is pretty good, I think. Next year, I think it's going to be a real challenge. We're going to have a lot of rookies on the grid next year, so I'm going to have to basically guess how good the drivers are going to be without any prior data. And that's going to definitely be a real challenge. And we're also going to have a bunch of new teammate pairings. We're going to have Leclerc Hamilton. We're going to have Albon Sainz. And let's see, I'm thinking. And then I think that's it for the non-rookie pairings. Everyone else is going to be paired with a rookie, which is going to make things very, very challenging from a modeling perspective, because again, you don't really know how they're going to do. And you're basically going to be guessing based on what their junior career results are going to be. So next year is going to be very, very challenging from a modeling perspective and predicting how things are going to go between teammates. But again, that's part of the fun. So again, thank you so much for watching. So that's my review of my predictions for the 2024 F1 season, as well as looking at my model results for both qualifying and the race. Starting either tomorrow or the day after, I'm going to start doing my statistical analysis of each of the 10 teams and their seasons, drivers, and all of that fun stuff. So look forward to that. So anyway, thanks you again so much for watching. Goodbye.